The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter Goodwin Woodson. The contents herein is the same as the 1933 Associated Publishers edition, except for the capitalization of black and Negro and the converting of tribe to group. Preface. Herein are recorded not opinions, but the reflections of one who for 40 years has participated in the education of the black, brown, and yellow races in both hemispheres and in tropical temperate regions. Such experience, too, has been with students in all grades, from the kindergarten to the university. The author, moreover, has traveled around the world to observe not only modern school systems in various countries, but to study the special systems set up by private agencies and governments to educate the natives in their colonies and dependencies. Some of these observations, too, have been checked against more recent studies on a later tour. Discussing herein the mistakes made in the education of the Negro, the writer frankly admits that he has committed some of these errors himself. In several chapters, moreover, he specifically points out wherein he himself has strayed from the path of wisdom. This book, then, is not intended as a broadside against any particular person or class, but it is given as a corrective for methods which have not produced satisfactory results. The author does not support the once popular views that in matters of education, Negroes are rightfully subjected to the will of others on the presumption that these poor people are not large taxpayers and must be content with charitable contributions to their uplift. The author takes the position that the consumer pays the tax, and as such, every individual of the social order should be given unlimited opportunity, make the most of himself. Such opportunity, too, should not be determined from without by forces set to direct the prescribed element in a way to rebound solely to the good of others, but should be determined by the makeup of the Negro himself and by what his environment requires of him. This new program of uplift, the author contends, should not be decided upon by the trial and error method in the application of devices used in dealing with others in a different situation and at other epochs. Only by careful study of the Negro himself and the life which he is forced to lead can we arrive at the proper procedure in this crisis. The mere imparting of information is not education. Above all things, the effort must result in making a man think and do for himself, just as the Jews have done in spite of universal persecution. In thus estimating the results obtained by the so-called education of the Negro, the author does not go to the census figures to show the progress of the race. It may be of no importance to the race to be able to boast today of many times as many educated members as it had in 1865. If they are of the wrong kind, the increase in numbers will be a disadvantage rather than an advantage. The other question which concerns us here is whether these educated persons are actually equipped to face the ordeal before them or unconsciously contribute to their own undoing by perpetuating the regimen of the oppressor. Herein, however, lies no argument for the oft-heard contention that education for the white man should mean one thing and for the Negro a different thing. The element of race does not enter here. It is merely a matter of exercising common sense in approaching people through their environment in order to deal with conditions as they are rather than as you would like to see them or imagine that they are. There may be a difference in method of attack, but the principle remains the same. Highly educated Negroes denounce persons who advocate for the Negro a sort of education different in some respects from that now given the white man. Negroes who have been so long inconvenienced and denied opportunities for development are naturally afraid of anything that sounds like discrimination. They are anxious to have everything the white man has, even if it is harmful. The possibility of originality in the Negro, therefore, is discounted 100% to maintain a nominal equality. If the whites decide to take up Mormonism, the Negroes must follow their lead. If the whites neglect such a study, then the Negroes must do likewise. The author, however, does not have such an attitude. He considers the educational system as it has developed both in Europe and America an antiquated process which does not hit the mark even in the case of the needs of the white man himself. If the white man wants to hold on to it, let him do so. But the Negro, so far as he is able, should develop and carry out a program of his own. The so-called modern education, with all its defects, however, does others so much more good than it does the Negro, because it has been worked out in conformity to the needs of those who have enslaved and oppressed weaker people. For example, the philosophy and ethics resulting from our educational system have justified slavery, peonage, segregation, and lynching. The oppressor has the right to exploit, to handicap, and to kill the oppressed. Negroes daily educated in the tenets of such a religion of the strong have accepted the status of weak and divinely ordained, and during the last 3 generations of their nominal freedom, they have done practically nothing to change it. Their pouting and resolutions indulged in by a few of the race have been of little avail. No systematic effort toward change has been possible. For taught the same economics, history, philosophy, literature, and religion which have established the present code of morals, the Negro's mind has been brought under the control of his oppressor. The problem of holding the Negro down, therefore, is easily solved. When you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. You do not have to tell him not to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it. You do not need to send him to the back door. He will go without being told. In fact, if there is no back door, he will cut one for his special benefit. His education makes it necessary. The same educational process which inspires and stimulates the oppressor with the thought that he is everything and has accomplished everything worthwhile, depresses and crushes at the same time the spark of the genius in the Negro by making him feel that his race does not amount to much and never will measure up to the standards of other peoples. The Negro thus educated is a hopeless liability of the race. The difficulty in that the educated Negro is compelled to live and move among his own people, whom he has been taught to despise. As a rule, therefore, the educated Negro prefers to buy his food from a white grocer because he has been taught that the Negro is not clean. It does not matter how often a Negro washes his hands then. He cannot clean them. And it does not matter how often a white man uses his hands. He cannot soil them. The educated Negro, moreover, is declined to take part in Negro business because he has been taught in economics that Negroes cannot operate in this particular sphere. The educated Negro gets less and less pleasure out of the Negro church, not on account of its primitiveness and increasing corruption, but because of his preference for the seats of righteousness controlled by his oppression. This has been his education, and nothing else can be expected of them. If the educated Negro could go off and be white, he might be happy, but only a mulatto now, and then can do this. The large majority of this class, then, must go through life denouncing white people because they are trying to run away from the blacks and decrying the blacks because they are not white. Chapter 1. The Seat of the Trouble. The educated Negroes have the attitude of contempt toward their own people because in their own as well as in their mixed school, Negroes are taught to admire the Hebrew, the Greek, the Latin, and the Teuton, and to despise the African. Of the hundreds of Negro high schools recently examined by an expert in the United States Bureau of Education, only 18 offer a course taking up the history of the Negro. And in most of the Negro colleges and universities where the Negro is thought of, the race is studied only as a problem or dismissed as of little consequence. For example, an officer of a Negro university, thinking that an additional course on the Negro should be given there, called upon a Negro doctor of philosophy of the faculty to offer such work. He promptly informed the officer that he knew nothing about the Negro. He did not go to the school to waste his time that way. He went to be educated in a system which dismisses the Negro as a non-entity. At a Negro summer school 2 years ago, a white instructor gave a course on the Negro, using for his text a work which teaches the whites are superior to the blacks. When asked by one of the students why he used such a textbook, the instructor replied that he wanted them to get that point of view. Even schools for Negroes, then, are places where they must be convinced of their inferiority. The thought of the inferiority of the Negro is drilled into him in almost every class he enters and in almost every book he studies. If he happens to leave school after he masters the fundamentals before he finishes high school or reach college, he will naturally escape some of this bias and may recover in time to be of service to his people. Practically all of the successful Negroes in this country are of the uneducated type, or of that of Negroes who had no formal education at all. The large majority of the Negroes who have put on the finishing touches of our best colleges are all but worthless in the development of their people. If, after leaving school, they have the opportunity to give out to Negroes what true traducers of the race would like to have and learn, such persons may thereby earn a living at teaching or preaching what they have been taught but they never become a constructive force in the development of the race. The so-called school then becomes a questionable factor in the life of this despised people. As another has well said, to handicap a student by teaching him that his black face is a curse and that his struggle to change his condition is hopeless is the worst sort of lynching. It kills one's aspirations and dooms him to vagabondage and crime. It is strange, then, that the friends of truth and the promoters of freedom have not risen up against the present propaganda in the schools and crushed it. This crusade is much more important than the anti-lynching movement, because there would be no lynching if it did not start in the schoolroom. Why not exploit, enslave, or exterminate a class that everybody is taught to regard as inferior? To be more explicit, we may go to the seat of the trouble. Our most widely known scholars have been trained in universities outside of the South. Northern and Western institutions, however, have had no time to deal with matters which concern the Negro especially. They must direct their attention to the problems of the majority of their constituents, and too often they have stimulated their prejudices by referring to the Negro as unworthy of consideration. Most of what these universities have offered as language, mathematics, and science may have served a good purpose, but much of what they have taught as economics, history, literature, religion, and philosophy is propaganda and can't that involved a waste of time and misdirected the Negroes thus trained. And even in the certitude of science or mathematics, it has been unfortunate that the approach to the Negro has been borrowed from a foreign method. For example, the teaching of arithmetic in the 5th grade in a backward county in Mississippi should mean one thing in the Negro school and a decidedly different thing in the white school. The Negro children, as a rule, come from the homes of tenants and peons who have to migrate annually from plantation to plantation, looking for light which they have never seen. The children from the homes of white planters and merchants live permanently in the midst of calculations, family budget, and the like, which enable them sometimes to learn more by contact than the Negro can acquire in school. Instead of teaching such Negro children less arithmetic, they should be taught much more, if that, than the white children. For the latter attend a graded school consolidated by free transportation, when the Negroes go to the one-room rented hovels to be taught without equipment and by incompetent teachers educated scarcely beyond the 8th grade. In schools of theology, Negroes are taught the interpretation of the Bible worked out by those who have justified segregation and winked at the economic debasement of the Negro sometimes, almost to the point of starvation. Deriving their sense of right from this teaching, graduates of such schools can have no message to grip the people whom they have been ill-trained to serve. Most of such miseducated ministers, therefore, preach to benches while illiterate Negro preachers do the best they can in supplying the spiritual needs of the masses. In the schools of business administration, Negroes are trained exclusively in the psychology and economics of Wall Street and are therefore made to despise the opportunities to run ice wagons, push banana carts, and sell peanuts among their own people. Foreigners who have not studied economics but have studied Negroes take up this business and grow rich. In schools of journalism, Negroes are being taught how to edit such metropolitan dailies as the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times, which would hardly hire a Negro as a janitor, and when these graduates come to the Negro weeklies for employment, they are not prepared to function in such establishments, which to be successful must be built upon accurate knowledge of the psychology and philosophy of the Negro. When a Negro has finished his education in our schools, then he has been equipped to begin the life of an Americanized or Europeanized white man. But before he steps from the threshold of his alma mater, he is told by his teachers that he must go back to his own people from whom he has been estranged by a vision of ideals which, in his disillusionment, he will realize that he cannot attain. He goes forth to play his part in life, but he must be both social and bisocial at the same time. While he is a part of the body politic, he is in addition to this a member of a particular race to which he must restrict himself in all matters social. While serving his country, he must serve within a special group. While being a good American, he must above all things be a good Negro. And to perform this definite function, he must learn to stay in a Negro's place. For the arduous task of serving a race thus handicapped. However, the Negro graduate has had little or no training at all. The people whom he has been ordered to serve have been belittled by his teachers to the extent that he can hardly find delight in undertaking what his education has led him to think impossible. Considering his race as blank in achievement, then, he sets out to stimulate their imitations of others. The performance is kept up a while, but like any other effort at meaningless imitation, it results in failure. Facing this undesirable result, the highly educated Negro often grows sour. He becomes too pessimistic to be a constructive force and usually develops into a chronic fault finder or a complainant at the bar of a public opinion. Often when he sees that the fault lies at the door of the white oppressor whom he is afraid to attack, he turns upon the pioneering Negro who is at work doing the best he can to extricate himself from an uncomfortable predicament. In this effort to imitate, however, these educated people are sincere. They hope to make the Negro conform quickly to the standards of the whites and thus remove the pretext for the barriers between the races. They do not realize, however, that even if the Negroes do successfully imitate the whites, nothing new has thereby been accomplished. You simply have a larger number of persons doing what others have been doing. The unusual gifts of the race have not thereby been developed, and an unwilling world therefore continues to wonder what the Negro is good for. The educated people, however, decry any such thing as race consciousness, and in the same respect they are right. They do not like to hear such expressions as Negro literature, Negro poetry, African art, or thinking black. And roughly speaking, we must concede that such things do not exist. These things did not figure in the courses which they pursued in school. And why should they? Aren't we all Americans? Then whatever is American is as much the heritage of the Negro as of any other group in this country. The highly educated contend, moreover, that when the Negro emphasizes these things, he invites racial discrimination by recognizing such differences of the races. The thought that the Negro is one thing and the white man another is the stock and trade argument of the Caucasian to justify segregation. Why then should the Negro blame the white man for doing what he himself does? These highly educated Negroes, however, fail to see that it is not the Negro who takes this position. The white man forces him to it, and to extricate himself from the Negro leader, he must so deal with the situation as to develop in the segregated group the power with which they can elevate themselves. The differentness of races, moreover, is no evidence of superiority or of inferiority. This merely indicates that each race has certain gifts which the others do not possess. It is by the development of these gifts that every race must justify its right to exist. Chapter 2. How we miss the mark. How we have arrived at the present state of affairs can be understood only by studying the forces effective in the development of Negro education, since it was systematically undertaken immediately after emancipation. To point out merely the defects as they appear today will be of little benefit to the present and future generations. These things must be viewed in their historic setting. The conditions of today have been determined by what has taken place in the past, and in a careful study of this history, we may see more clearly the great theater of events in which the Negro has played a part. We may understand better what his role has been and how well he has functioned in it. The idea of educating the Negroes after the Civil War was largely a promoting of philanthropy. Their white neighbors failed to assume this responsibility. These black people had been liberated as a result of a sectional conflict out of which their former owners had emerged as victims. From this class, then, the freedmen could not expect such much sympathy or cooperation in the effort to prepare themselves to figure as citizens of a modern republic. From functionaries of the United States government itself and for those who participated in the conquest of the secessionists early came the plan of teaching these freedmen the simple duties of life as worked out by the Freedmen's Bureau and philanthropic agencies. When systemized, this effort became a program for the organization of churches and schools and the direction of them along lines which had been considered most conducive to the progress of people otherwise circumstanced. Here and there, some variations was made in this program, in view of the fact that the status of the freedmen in no way paralleled that of their friends and teachers. But such thought was not general. When the Negroes in some way would learn to perform the duties which other elements of the population had prepared themselves to discharge, they would be duly qualified, it was believed, to function as citizens of the country. Inasmuch as most Negroes lived in the agricultural South, moreover, only a few of them at first acquired small farms. There was little in their life which any one of thought could have not easily understood. The poverty which afflicted them for generations after emancipation held them down to the lowest order of society, nominally free but economically enslaved. The participation of the freedmen in government for a few years during the period known as the Reconstruction had little bearing on their situation except that they did join with the uneducated poor whites in bringing about certain much desired social reforms, especially in giving the South its first plan of democratic education and providing for a school system at public expense. Neither this inadequately supported school system nor the struggling higher institutions of a classical order established by the same time, however, connected the Negroes very closely with life as it was. These institutions were concerned rather with life as they hoped to make it. When the Negro found himself deprived of influence in politics, therefore at the same time unprepared to participate in the higher functions in the industrial development which this country began to undergo, it soon became evident to him that he was losing ground in the basic things of life. He was spending his time studying about the things which had been or might be, but he was learning little to help him to do better the task at hand. Since the Negroes believed that the causes of this untoward condition lay without race, migration was attempted, and immigration to Africa was again urged. At this psychological moment came the wave of industrial education which swept the country by storm. The educational authorities in the cities and states throughout the Black Belt began to change the course of study to make the training of the Negro conform to this policy. The missionary teachers from the North, in defense of their idea of more liberal training, however, fearlessly attacked these new educational policies, and the Negroes participating in the same dispute arrayed themselves respectively on one side or the other. For a generation thereafter, the quarrel as to whether the Negro should be given a classical or a practical education was the dominant topic in Negro schools and churches throughout the United States. Labor was the most important thing of life, it was argued. Practical education counted in reaching the end, and the Negro worker must be taught to solve this problem of efficiency before directing attention to other things. Others, more narrow-minded than the advocates of industrial education, seized upon the idea, feeling that, although the Negro must have some semblance of education, It would be a fine stroke to be able to make a distinction between the training given the Negro and that provided for the whites. Inasmuch as the industrial education idea rapidly gained ground, too many Negroes for political purposes began to espouse it, and schools and colleges, hoping thereby to obtain money, worked out accordingly, making makeshift provisions for such instructions. Although they could not satisfactorily offer it, a new, real industrial school actually equipped themselves for this work and turned out a number of graduates with such preparation. Unfortunately, however, the affair developed into a sort of battle of words, for in spite of all they said and did, the majority of the Negroes, those who did make some effort to obtain an education, did not actually receive either the industrial or the classical education. Negroes attended industrial schools, took such training as was prescribed, and received their diplomas, but few of them developed adequate efficiency to be able to do what they were supposedly trained to do. The schools in which they were educated could not provide all the experience with machinery which white apprentices trained in factories had. Such industrial education as the Negroes received then was merely to master a technique already discarded in progressive centers, and even in less complicated operations of industry, these schools had no such facilities as to parallel the numerous processes of factories conducted on the plane of the division of labor. Except what value such training might have in the development of the mind by making practical applications of mathematics and science, then it was a failure. The majority of Negro graduates of industrial schools, therefore, have gone into other avenues, and too often into those for which they have had no preparation whatever. Some few who actually prepared for the industrial sphere by self-improvement likewise sought other occupations, for the reason that Negroes were generally barred from higher pursuits by trades, unions, and being unable to develop captains of industry to increase the demand of persons in these lines. The Negroes have not opened up many such opportunities for themselves. During these years, too, the schools for the classical education for Negroes have not done any better. They have proceeded on the basis that every ambitious person needs a liberal education, when a matter of fact this does not necessarily follow. The Negro trained in the advanced phases of literature, philosophy, and politics has been unable to develop far in using his knowledge because having to function in the lower spheres of social order. Advanced knowledge of science, mathematics, and languages, moreover, has not been much more useful except for mental discipline because of the dearth of opportunity to apply such knowledge among people who were largely common laborers in towns or peons on the plantation. The extent to which such higher education has been successful in leading the Negro to think, which above all is the chief purpose of education, has merely made him more of a malcontent when he can sense the drift of things and appreciate the impossibility of success, envisioning conditions as they really are. It is very clear, therefore, that we do not have in the life of the Negro today a large number of persons who have been benefited by either of the systems by which we have quarreled so long. The number of Negro mechanics and artisans have comparatively declined during the last 2 generations. The Negroes do not proportionately represent many skilled laborers as they did before the Civil War. If the practical education which the Negroes received helped to improve the situation so that it is today no worse than what it was, certainly it did not solve the problem as was expected of it. On the other hand, in spite of much classical education of the Negroes, we do not find the race a large supply of thinkers and philosophers. One excuse is that scholarship among Negroes has been vitiated by the necessity for all of them to combat segregation and fight to retain standing ground in the struggle of the races. Comparatively, few American Negroes have produced credible literature, and still fewer have made any large contributions to philosophy or science. They have not risen to the heights of black men farther removed from the influences of slavery and segregation. For this reason, we do not find among American Negroes a Pushkin, a Gomez, a Jeffrey, a Captain, or a Dumas. Even men like Roland Hayes, Henry O. Tanner have risen to the higher levels by getting out of this country to relieve themselves of our stifling traditions and to recover from their education. Chapter 3. How we drifted away from the truth. How then did the education of the Negro take such a trend? The people who maintained schools for the education of certain Negroes before the Civil War was certainly sincere, and so were the missionary workers who went south to enlighten the freedmen after the results of the conflict had given the Negroes a new status. These earnest workers, however, had more enthusiasm than knowledge. They did not understand the task before them. This undertaking, too, was more of an effort toward social uplift than actual education. Their aim was to transform the Negroes, not to develop them. The freedmen who were to be enlightened were given little thought, for the best friends of the race, ill-taught themselves, followed the traditional curricula of the times, which did not take the Negro into consideration except for to condemn or pity him. In geography, the races were described in conformity with the program of the usual propaganda to engender in whites a race hate of the Negro, and in Negroes contempt for themselves. A poet of distinction was selected to illustrate the physical features of the white race. A bedecked chief of a group, those of the red, a proud warrior, the brown, a prince, the yellow, and a savage with a ring in his nose, and of course the Negro stood at the foot of the social ladder. The description of the various parts of the world was worked out according to the same plan. The parts inhabited by Caucasians were treated in detail. Less attention was given to the yellow people, still less to the red, very little to the brown, and particularly none to the black race. Those people who are far removed from the physical characteristics of Caucasians, or who do not materially assist them in domination of exploitation of others, were not mentioned except to be belittled or decried. From the teaching of science, the Negro was likewise eliminated. The beginning of science in various parts of the Orient were mentioned, but the Africans' early advancement in the field was omitted. Students were not told that ancient Africans of the interior knew sufficient science to concoct poisons for arrowheads, to mix durable colors for paintings, to extract metals from nature and refine them for development in industrial arts. Very little was said about the chemistry and the method of Egyptian embalming, which was the product of the mixed breeds of northern Africa, now known in the modern world as colored people. In the study of language in school, pupils were made to scoff at the Negro dialect as some peculiar possession of the Negro, which they should despise rather than directed to study the background of this language as a broken-down African tongue. In short, to understand their own linguistic history, which is certainly more important for them than the study of French phonetics or historical Spanish grammar. To the African language as such no attention was given except in case of the preparation of traders, missionaries, and public functionaries to exploit the natives. This number of persons, thus trained, of course, constituted a small fraction hardly deserving attention. From literature, the African was excluded altogether. He was not supposed to have expressed any thought worth knowing. The philosophy in the African proverbs and in the rich folklore of that continent was ignored to give preference to the developed of the distant shores of the Mediterranean. Most missionary teachers of the freedmen, like most men of our time, had never read the interesting books of travel in Africa and had never heard of the Tariq es Sudan. In the teaching of fine arts, these instructors usually started with Greece by showing how the art was influenced from without, but they omitted the African influence, which scientists now regard as significant and dominant in early Hellas. They failed to teach the student the Mediterranean melting pot with the Negroes from Africa bringing their wares, their ideas, and their blood therein to influence the history of Greece, Carthage, and Rome, making desire father to the thought. Our teacher either ignored these influences or endeavors to belittle them by working out theories to the contrary. The basis did not stop at this point, for it invaded the teaching of the professions. Negro law students were told that they belonged to the most criminal element in the country, and an effort was made to justify the procedure in the seats of injustice where law was interpreted as being one thing for the white man and a different thing for the Negro. In constitutional law, the spineless of the United States Supreme Court in permitting the judicial nullifications of the 14th and 15th Amendments was and still is boldly upheld in our few law schools. In medical schools, Negroes were likewise convinced of their inferiority in being reminded of their role as germ carriers. The prevalence of syphilis and tuberculosis among Negroes was especially emphasized without showing that these maladies are more deadly among the Negroes for the reason that they are Caucasian diseases. And since these plagues are new to Negroes, these sufferers have not had time to develop against them the immunity which time has permitted in the Caucasian. Other diseases to which Negroes easily fall prey to were mentioned to point out the race as an undesirable element when this condition was due to the Negro's economic and social status. Little emphasis was placed upon the immunity of the Negro from diseases like yellow fever and influenza, which are so disastrous to whites. Yet the whites are not considered inferior because of this differential resistance to these plagues. In history, of course, the Negro had no place in this curriculum. He was pictured as a human being of the lower order, unable to subject a passion to reason, and therefore useful only when made to hewer of wood in the drawer of the water and others. No thought was given to the history of Africa except so far as it had been a field of exploitation for the Caucasian. You might study the history as it was offered in our system from the elementary school throughout the university, and you would never hear Africa mentioned except in the negative. You would never thereby learn that Africans first domesticated the sheep, goat, and cow, developed the idea of trial by jury, produced the first stringed instrument, and gave the world its greatest boon in the discovery of iron. You would never know that prior to the Mohammedan invasion about 1000 AD, these natives in the heart of Africa had developed powerful kingdoms which were later organized on a Songhai empire on the order of that the Romans and boasting of similar grandeur. Unlike other people, then, the Negro, according to this point of view, was an exception to the natural plan of things, and he had no such mission as that of an outstanding contribution to culture. An observer from outside of the situation naturally inquires why the Negroes, many of whom serve their race as teachers, have not changed this program. These teachers, however, are powerless. Negroes have no control over their education and have little voice in their affairs pertaining thereto. In a few cases, Negroes have chosen as members of public boards of education, and some have been appointed members of private boards. But these Negroes are always such a small minority that they do not figure in the final working out of the educational program. The education of Negroes, then, the most important thing in the uplift of the Negroes, is almost entirely in the hands of those who have enslaved them and now segregate them. With miseducated Negroes in control themselves, however, it is doubtful that the system would be very much different from what it is, or that it would rapidly undergo change. The Negroes thus placed in charge would be the product of the same system and would show no more conception of the task at hand than do the whites who have educated them and shaped their minds as they would have them in function. Negro educators of today may have more sympathy and interest in the race than the whites now exploiting Negro institutions as educators, but the former have no more vision than their competitors. Taught from books of the same bias, trained by Caucasians of the same prejudices, or by Negroes of enslaved minds, one generation of Negro teachers after another have served for no higher purpose than to do what they are told to do. In other words, a Negro teacher instructing Negro children is in many respects a white teacher thus engaged, for the program in which each is about the same. There can be no reasonable objection to the Negroes doing what the white man tells him to do. If the white man tells him to do what is right, well, right is purely relative. The present system under the control of whites trained the Negro to be white, and at the same time convinces him of the impropriety of the impossibility of his becoming white. It compels the Negro to become a good Negro, for the performance of which his education is ill-suited. For the white man's exploitation of the Negro through economic restriction and segregation, the present system is sound and will doubtless continue until this gives place to the saner policy of actual interracial cooperation, not the present farce of racial manipulation in which the Negro is a figurehead. History does not furnish a case of the evaluation of a people by ignoring the thought and aspiration of the people thus served. This is slightly dangerous here, however, for the Negro's mind has been all but perfectly enslaved in that he has been trained to think what is desired of him. The highly educated Negro do not like to hear anything uttered against this procedure because they make their living this way, and they feel that they must defend the system. Few miseducated Negroes ever act otherwise. If they so express themselves, they are easily crushed by the large majority to the contrary, so that the procession may move on without interruption. The result, then, is that the Negroes thus miseducated are of no service to themselves and none to the white man. The white man does not need the Negro's professional, commercial, or industrial assistance, and as a result of the multiplication of mechanical appliances, he no longer needs them in drudgery or menial service. The highly educated Negroes, moreover, do not need the Negro professional or commercial classes, because Negroes have been taught that whites can serve them more efficiently in these spheres. Reduced, then, to teaching and preaching, the Negroes will have no outlet but to go down a blind alley. If the sort of education which they are now receiving is to enable them to find the way out of their present difficulties. Education under outside control. In the new program of educating the Negro, what will become of the white teachers of the race? Someone recently inquired. This is a simple question requiring a brief answer. The remaining few Christian workers who went south not so long after the Civil War and established schools and churches to lay the foundation on which we should now be building more wisely than we do, we would honor as a martyr throne. Anathema be upon him who would utter a word derogatory to the record of these heroes and heroines. We would pay high tribute also to unselfish Southerners like Haygood, Curry, Bruckner, Northern, and Vance, and to white men of our time who believed that the only way to elevate people is to help them to help themselves. The unfortunate successors of the Northern missionary teachers of Negroes, however, have thoroughly demonstrated that they have no useful function in the life of the Negro. They have not the spirit of their predecessors and do not measure up to the requirements of educators and desired in accredited colleges. If Negro institutions are to be as efficient as those for the whites in the South, the same high standards for the educators to direct them should be maintained. Negro schools cannot go forward with such a load of insufficiency, and especially when the white presidents of these institutions are often less scholarly than Negroes who have to serve under them. By law and custom, the white presidents and teachers of Negro schools are prevented from participating freely in the life of the Negro. They occupy, therefore, a most uncomfortable dual position. When the author once taught in a school with a mixed faculty, the white woman connected with the institution would bow to him in patronizing fashion when on the campus, but elsewhere they did not see him. A white president of one Negro school never entertains a Negro in his home, preferring to shift such guests to the students' dining room. Another white president of Negro college maintains on the campus a guest cottage which Negroes can enter only as servants. Still, another such functionary does not allow students to enter his home through the front door. Negroes trained under such conditions without protest become downright cowards, and in life will continue as slaves in spite of their nominal emancipation. What different method of approach or what sort of appeal would one make to the Negro child that cannot be made just as well by a white teacher? Someone asked not long ago. To be frank, we must concede that there is no particular body of facts that Negro teachers can impart to children of their own race that may not be just as easily presented by persons of another race if they have the same attitude as Negro teachers. But in most cases, traditions, race hate, segregation, and terrorism make such things impossible. The only thing to do in this case, then, is to deal with the situation as it is. Yet we should not take this position that a qualified white person should not teach in a Negro school. For certain work temporarily, some whites may be able to do better than Negroes. There can be no objection to such service. But if the Negro is to be forced to live in the ghetto, he can more easily develop out of it under his own leadership than under that which is superimposed. The Negro will never be able to show off his originality as long as his efforts are directed from without by those who socially prescribe him. Such friends will unconsciously keep him in the ghetto. Herein, however, the emphasis is not upon the necessity for separate systems, but upon the need for common sense schools and teachers who understand and continue in sympathy with those whom they instruct. Those who take the position to the contrary have the idea that education is merely a process of imparting information. One who can give out these things or devise any easy plan for so doing, then, is an educator. In a sense, this is true, but it accounts for most of the troubles of the Negro. Real education means to inspire people to live more abundantly, to learn to begin with life as they find and make it better. But the instruction so far given Negroes in colleges and universities has worked to the contrary. In most cases, much graduates have merely increased the number of malcontents who offer no program of changing the undesirable conditions about which they complain. One should rely upon protest only when it's supported by a constructive program. Unfortunately, Negroes who think as the author does and dare express themselves are branded as opponents of interracial cooperation. As a matter of fact, however, such Negroes are the real workers in carrying out a program of interracial effort. Cooperation implies equality of the participants in the particular task at hand. On the contrary, however, the usual way now is for the whites to work out their plans behind closed doors, have them approved by a few Negroes serving nominally on a board, and then employ a white or mixed staff to carry out their program. This is not interracial cooperation. It is merely the ancient idea of calling upon the inferior to carry out the orders of the superior. To express in a post-classic language, as did Jesse O. Thomas, the Negroes do the cooing and the whites the operating. This unsound attitude of the friends of the Negro is due to the persistence of the medieval idea of controlling underprivileged classes. Behind closed doors, these friends say you need to be careful in advancing Negroes to commanding positions unless it can be determined beforehand that they will do what they are told to do. You can never tell when some Negroes will break out and embarrass their friends. After being advanced to positions of influence, some of them have been known to run amok and advocate social equality or demand for their race the privileges of democracy when they should restrict themselves to education and religious development. It is often said, too, that the time is not ripe for Negroes to take over the administration of their institution, for they do not have the contacts for raising money. But what becomes of this argument when we remember what Booker T. Washington did for Tuskegee and observe what R. Moulton and John Hope are doing today? As the first Negro president of Howard University, Mordecai Johnson has raised more money for that institution among philanthropists than all of its former presidents combined. Furthermore, if after 3 generations the Negro colleges have not produced men qualified to administer their affairs, such as admission in an eloquent argument that they have failed ingloriously and should be immediately closed. Recently, someone asked me how I connect my criticism of the higher education of the Negroes with new developments in this sphere, and especially with the 4 universities in the South, which are to be made by the millions obtained from governments, boards, and philanthropies. I believe that the establishment of these 4 centers of learning at Washington, Atlanta, Nashville, and New Orleans can be so carried out as to mark an epoch in the development of the Negro race. On the other hand, there's just as much possibility for a colossal failure of the whole scheme if these institutions are to be the replica of universities like Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and Chicago. If the men who are to be administer them and teach in them are to be the products of roll-top desk theorists who have never touched the life of the Negro, the money thus invested will be just as profitably spent if it is used to buy peanuts to throw at the animals in a circus. Some of the thought behind the new educational movement is to provide in the South for educating the Negroes who are now crowding northern universities, especially the medical schools, many of which will not admit Negroes because of the racial friction in hospital practice. In the rush merely to make special provisions for these undesirable students, however, the institutions which are to train them may be established on false ideas and make the same blunders of the smaller institutions which have preceded them. It will hardly help a poisoned patient to give him a large dose of poison. In higher institutions for Negroes, organized along lines required for people differently circumstanced, some few may profit by being further grounded in the fundamentals. Others may become more adept in the exploitation of their people, and a smaller number may cross the divide and join the whites in useful service. But the large majority of the products of such institutions will increase rather than diminish the load which the masses have had to carry ever since their emancipation. Such ill-prepared workers will have no foundation upon which to build. The education of many people should begin with the people themselves. But Negroes thus trained have been dreaming about the ancients of Europe and about those who have tried to imitate them. In a course at Harvard, for example, students were required to find out whether Purcells were justly charged in trying to supplement the worship of Jupiter with that of Juno. Since that time, Negroes thus engaged have learned that they would have been much better prepared for work among the Negroes in the Black Belt if they had spent that time learning why John Jasper of Sun Du Mu fame joined with Joshua in contending that the planet stood still in the middle of the line while he fought the battle the second time. Talking the other day with one of the men now giving the millions to build the 4 Negro universities in the South. However, I find that he is of the opinion that accredited institutions can be established in mushroom fashion with theorists of the touch with the people. In other words, you can go almost anywhere and build a $3 million plant, place in charge a white man to do what you want accomplished, and in short, while he can secure or have trained to order the men necessary to make a university. We want here, he will say, a man who has a master's degree in English. Send me another who has his doctor's degree in sociology, and I can use one more in physics. Now, experience has shown that men of this type may fill in, but a university cannot be established with such raw recruits. The author once had some experience in trying to man a college in this fashion, and the result was a story that would make an interesting headline for the newspaper. When Dr. William Bainey Harper was establishing the University of Chicago, he called to the headship of the various departments only men who had distinguished themselves in the creative world. Some had advanced degrees and some had not. Several of them had never done any formal graduate work at all. All of them, however, were men whose thought was moving the world. It may be argued that the Negroes have no such men, and must have them trained, but such a thing cannot be forced as we are now doing it. It would be much better to stimulate the development of the more progressive teachers of old than experiment with novices produced by the degradation of higher education. The degradation of the doctorate especially dawned upon the author the day more clearly than ever when a friend of his rushed into his office saying, "I've been trying to see you for several days. I've just failed to get a job for which I have been working, and I'm told that I cannot expect a promotion until I get my doctor's degree." That is what he called it. He could not even pronounce the words, but he is determined to have his doctor's degree to get the job in sight. The shameful status of higher education is due in large measure to low standards of institutions with tendency toward the diploma mill procedure. To get a job or hold one, you go in and stay until they grind you out a doctorate degree, and you do not have to worry any further. The assumption is that almost any school will be glad to have you thereafter, and you will receive a large salary. Investigation has shown, however, that men who have the doctorate not only lose touch with the common people, but they do not as much creative work as those of less formal education. After having this honor conferred upon them, these so-called scholars often rest on their oars. Few persons have thought of this seriousness of such an area among men who are put in the lead of things because of meeting statutory requirements of frontier universities, which are not of the frontier. The General Education Board and the Julius Rosenwald Fund have a policy which may be a partial solution of the underdeveloped Negro college instructors' problem. These foundations are giving Negro teachers scholarships to improve themselves for work in the sphere in which they are now laboring in the South. These boards, as a rule, do not send one to school to work for the doctor's degree. If they find a man of experience and good judgment, showing possibilities for growth, they will provide for him to study a year or more to refresh his mind with whatever there is new in his field. Experience has shown that teachers thus helped have later done much better work than doctors of philosophy made to order. The northern universities, moreover, cannot do graduate work for Negroes along certain lines when they are concentrating on the educational needs of people otherwise circumstanced. The graduate school for Negroes studying chemistry is with George W. Carver at Tuskegee. At least 100 youths should wait daily upon the words of this scientist to be able to pass on the generations unborn his great knowledge of agriculture chemistry. Negroes desiring to specialize in agriculture should do it with workers like T.M. Campbell and B.F. Hubbard among the Negro farmers of the South. In education itself, the situation is the same. Neither Columbia nor Chicago can give an advanced course in Negro rural education, for their work in education is based primarily upon what they know of the educational needs of the whites. Such work for Negroes must be done under the direction of the trailblazer who are built under Negroes must be done under the direction of the trailblazers who are building school houses and reconstructing the educational program of those in the backwoods. Leaders of this type can supply the foundation upon which a university of realistic education may be established. We offer no argument here against earning advanced degrees, but these should come as honors conferred for training crowned with scholastic distinction, not to enable a man to increase his salary or find a better paying position. The schools which are now directing attention exclusively to these external marks of learning would not contribute much to the uplift of the Negro. In Cleveland, not long ago, the author found at the Western Reserve University something unusually encouraging. A native of Mississippi, a white man trained in Northern University and now serving as a professor in one, has under him a sociology, a Negro student from Georgia. For his dissertation, this Negro is collecting the sayings of his people in everyday life, their morning greetings, their remarks about the weather, their comments on things which happen around them, their reactions to these things which strike them as unusual, and their efforts to interpret life as the panorama passes before them. This white Mississippian and black Georgian are on the right way to understand the Negro, and if they do not fall out about social equality, they will serve the Negro much better than those who are trying to find out whether Henry VIII lusted more after Anne Boleyn than after Catherine of Aragon, or whether Elizabeth was justly styled as more untruthful than Philip II of Spain. Chapter 6. The educated Negro leaves the masses. One of the most striking evidences of the failure of higher education among Negroes is their estrangement from the masses, the very people upon whom they must eventually count for carrying out a program of progress. Of this, the Negro churches supply the most striking illustration. The large majority of Negro communicants still belong to these churches, but the more education the Negro undergoes, the less comfort they seem to find in these evangelical groups. These churches do not measure up to the standards set by the university preachers of the northern centers of learning. Most Negroes returning as finished products from such institutions, then, are forever lost to the popular Negro churches. The unchurched of these class do not become members of such congregations, as those who have thus connected themselves remain chiefly for political or personal reasons and tend to become communicants in name only. The Negro church, however, although not a shadow of what it ought to be, is the great asset of the race. It is a part of the capital that the race must invest to make its future. The Negro church has taken the lead in education in the schools of the race. It has supplied a forum for the thought of the highly educated Negro. It has originated a large portion of the business controlled by Negroes, and in many cases it has made it possible for Negro professional men to exist. It is unfortunate, then, that these classes do not do more to develop the institution. In thus neglecting it, they are throwing away what they have, to obtain something which they think they need. In many respects, then, the Negro church during recent generations has become corrupt. It could be improved, but those Negroes who can help the institution have deserted it to the exploiters, grafters, and libertines. The highly educated Negroes have turned away from the people in the churches, and the gap between the masses and the talented 10 is rapidly widening. Of this, many examples may be cited. When the author recently attended Washington, D.C., one of the popular Negro churches, with a membership of several thousand, he saw a striking case in evidence. While sitting there, he thought of what a power this group could become under the honest leadership of intelligent men and women. Social uplift, business, public welfare, all have their possibilities there if a score or more of our highly educated Negroes would work with these people at the center. Looking carefully throughout the audience for such persons, however, he recognized only 2 college graduates, Kelly Miller and himself, but the former had come to receive from the church a donation to the community chest, and the author had come, according to appointment, to make an appeal in behalf of Miss Nannie H. Burroughs' school. Neither one had manifested any interest in the particular church. This is the way most of them receive attention from our talented 10th. Some highly educated Negroes say that they have not lost their interest in religion, that they have gone into churches with a more intellectual atmosphere in keeping with their new thoughts and aspirations. And then there is a sort of contagious fever which takes away from the churches of their youth others of less formal education. Talking with a friend from Alabama the other day, the author found out that after her father had died and she had moved to Washington, she forsook the Baptist church in which he had been a prominent worker and joined a ritualistic church, which is more fashionable. Such a change of faith is all right in a sense, for no sensible person today would dare to make an argument in favor of any particular religion. Religion is but religion. If the people live up to the faith they profess. What is said here with respect to the popular churches of Negroes, which happen to be chiefly Methodist and Baptist, would hold also if they were mainly Catholic and apostolic, provided the large majority of Negroes belong to those churches. The point here is that the ritualistic churches into which these Negroes have gone do not touch the masses, and they show no promising future for racial development. Some institutions are controlled by those who offer the Negroes only limited opportunity, and then sometimes on the condition that they be segregated in the court of the Gentiles outside of the temple of Jehovah. How an educated Negro can thus leave the church of his people and accept such Jim Crowism has always been a puzzle. He cannot be thinking man, and it may be a sort of slave psychology which causes this preference for the leadership of the oppressor. The excuse sometimes given for seeking such religious leadership is that the Negro evangelical churches are foggy, but a thinking man would rather be behind the times and have his self-respect than compromise his manhood by accepting segregation. They say that in some of the Negro churches, bishopric are actually bought, but it is better for the Negro to belong to a church where one can secure a bishopric by purchase than be a member of one which would deny the promotion on account of color. With respect to developing the masses, then, the Negro race has lost ground in recent years. In 1880, when the Negroes had begun to make themselves felt in teaching, the attitude of the leaders was different from what it is today. At that time, men went off to school to prepare themselves for the uplift of a downtrodden people. In our time, too many Negroes go to school to memorize certain facts to pass examinations for jobs. After they obtain these positions, they pay little attention to humanity. This attitude of the educated Negro towards the masses results partly from the general trend of all persons towards selfishness, but it works more disastrously among the Negroes than among the whites, because the lower classes of the latter have had so much more opportunity. For some time, the author has been making a special study of the Negroes in the city of Washington to compare their condition of today with that of the past. Now, although the highly educated Negroes of the District of Columbia have multiplied and apparently are in better circumstances than ever, the masses show almost as much backwardness as they did in 1880. Sometimes you find as many as 2 or 3 storefront churches in a single block where Negroes indulge in heathen-like practices which could hardly be equaled in the jungle. The Negroes in Africa have not descended in such depths. Although born and brought up in the black belt of the South, the author never saw such idolatrous tendencies as he has seen under the dome of the Capitol. Such conditions show that the underdeveloped Negro has been abandoned by those who should help him. The educated white man, said an observer recently, differs from the educated Negro who so readily forsakes the belated element of his race. When a white man sees persons of his own race trending downward to a level of disgrace, he does not rest until he works out some plan to lift such unfortunates to higher ground. But the Negro forgets the delinquents of his race and goes his way to feather his own nest, as he has done in leaving the masses in the popular churches. This is sad indeed, for the Negro church is the only institution the race controls. With the exception of the feeble efforts of a few all but starved out institutions, the education of the Negroes is controlled by the other element. And save the dramatization of practical education by Booker T. Washington, Negroes have not influenced the system at all in America. In business, the lack of capital, credit, and experience has prevented large undertakings to accumulate the wealth necessary for the ease and comfort essential to higher culture. In the church, however, the Negro has had sufficient freedom to develop his situation in his own way, but he has failed to do so. His religion is merely a loan from the whites who have enslaved and segregated the Negroes, and the organization, though largely an independent Negro institution, is dominated by the thought of the oppressors of the race. The educated Negro minister is so trained as to drift away from the masses and the illiterate preachers into whose hands the people inevitably fall are unable to develop a doctrine and procedure of their own. The dominant thought is to make use of the dogma of the whites as means to an end. Whether the system is what it should be or not, it serves the purpose. In chameleon-like fashion, the Negro has taken up almost everything religious which has come along instead of thinking for himself. The English split off from the Catholics because Henry VIII had difficulty in getting sanctions from the church to satisfy his lust for the amorous women, and Negroes went with this ilk, singing, "God save the King." Others later said the thing necessary in baptism by immersion, and the Negroes joined them as Baptists. Another circle of promoters next said we must have a new method of doing things, and we shall call ourselves Methodists, and the Negroes then embraced the faith. The Methodists and Baptists split up further on account of the custom of holding slaves, and the Negroes arrayed themselves on the respective side. The religious agitators divided still more on questions beyond human power to understand, and the Negroes started out in similar fashion to imitate them. For example, 30 of the 213 religious bodies reported in 1926 were exclusively Negro, while 30, which were primarily white denominations, had one or more Negro churches among their number. In other words, Negroes have gone into practically all sects established by the whites, and in addition to these, they have established 30 of their own to give the system further complication and subdivision. The situation in these churches is aggravated too by having too many ministers and about 5 times as many supervisory officials as a church embracing all Negro communicants would actually need. All of the Negro Methodists in the world, if united, would not need more than 12 bishops, and these would have time to direct the affairs of both Methodists and Baptists in the United Church. There is no need for 3 or 4 bishops, each teaching the same faith and practice while duplicating the work of the other in the same era, merely because a long time ago somebody following the ignorant oppressor of the race in these churches committed the sin of dissension and strife. For all of this unnecessary expense, impoverished Negroes have to pay. The theology of foreigners, too, is the important factor in this disunion of churches and the burden which they impose on unenlightened people. Theologians have been the bane of bliss and source of woe. While bringing the joy of conquest to their own camp, they have confused the world with disputes which have divided the church and stimulated division and subdivision to the extent that it no longer functions as a Christian agency for the uplift of all men. To begin with, theology is of pagan origin. Albert Magnus and Thomas Aquinas worked out the first system of it by applying to religious discussion the logic of Aristotle, a pagan philosopher, who believed neither in the creation of the world nor the immortality of the soul. At best, it was degenerate learning, based upon the theory that knowledge is gained by the mind working upon itself rather than upon matter or through sense perception. The world was therefore confused with this discussion of absurdities, as it is today by those of prominent churchmen. By their peculiar reasoning, too, theologians have sanctioned most of the ills of the ages. They justify the Inquisition, serfdom, and slavery. Theologians of our time defend segregation and the annihilation of one race by the other. They have drifted away from righteousness into an effort to make a wrong seem to be right. While we must hold the Negroes responsible for following these ignorant theorists, we should not charge their account the origination of this nonsense with which they have confused thoughtless people. As said above, the Negro has been so busy doing what he is told to do that he has not stopped long enough to think about the meaning of these things. He has borrowed the ideas of his traducers instead of delving into things and working out some thought of his own. Some Negro leaders of these religious factions know better, but they hold their following by keeping the people divided and emphasizing non-essentials, the insignificance of which the average man may not appreciate. The highly educated Negroes who know better than to follow these unprincipled men have abandoned these popular churches. While serving as the avenue of the oppressor's propaganda, the Negro Church, although doing some good, has prevented the union of diverse elements and has kept the race too weak to overcome foes who have purposely taught Negroes how to quarrel and fight about trifles until their enemies can overcome them. This is the keynote to the control of the so-called inferior races by the self-styled superior. The one thinks and plans while the other in excited fashion seizes upon and destroys his brother with whom he should cooperate.